Welcome back. Tonight, we drift softly into a quiet English village where Miss Marple waits among whispers, teacups, and secrets hidden in the dark. It was a perfect summer afternoon in St. Mary's, Crissington, the kind of day that made the village seem like something out of a postcard, idyllic, peaceful, untouched by the worries of the world. The scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air, mingling with the distant hum of laughter from the annual bake sale being held in the village hall. Yet, as Miss Marple sat by the window of Mrs. Green's tea shop, her keen eyes narrowing on the scene unfolding in the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There was a subtle unease beneath the village's seemingly perfect facade. A small glint of something too bright, too sharp, caught her attention in the glimmering sunlight, an object of value, hidden in plain sight. She didn't know it yet, but that simple, gleaming heirloom ring, carefully placed on a velvet cushion at the display table, would be the beginning of a mystery that would unravel everything the villagers thought they knew about each other. As the chatter of the event grew louder, Miss Marple's mind moved like a clockwork machine, already assembling the pieces. She had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and those instincts whispered that today, in this seemingly innocent gathering, the village would soon be shaken by a crime far more dangerous than the disappearance of a mere piece of jewelry. And before the night was out, someone would have blood on their hands. Chapter 1. The Bake Sale Begins. The sun shone through the thick green leaves of the oaks lining the main street of St. Mary's, Crissington, casting a dappled pattern across the neatly cobbled roads. It was one of those mornings that felt almost too perfect, the kind that seemed designed for a leisurely stroll, a friendly chat at the local tea shop, or, as the good folk of the village knew all too well, the annual bake sale at the village hall. This was the day when the community gathered together in a jolly display of homemade pastries, cakes, and pies, and if the weather could be coaxed into a sunnier mood, it was, in the minds of the villagers, the perfect day for a little intrigue. Miss Jane Marple sat on her favorite bench outside Mrs. Green's tea shop, a pleasant smile resting on her face, though her sharp eyes were scanning the scene with a mixture of calm amusement and quiet curiosity. She had no intention of taking part in the bake sale itself, preferring instead to watch the bustle from her perch. The village, she thought with a touch of nostalgia, was as it always was. Yet it was moments like this that she would later reflect upon, once the mystery had unfolded, as the calm before the storm. There was, after all, always something peculiar about such gatherings. She had seen it time and again in her many years of village life. People, for all their good intentions, had a curious way of hiding things in plain sight. A look here, a gesture there. These were the little pieces of the puzzle that she had long since learned to detect. "Good morning, Miss Marple," came a voice that pulled her from her musings. She looked up to find Rosamund Hawthorn standing before her, a slight frown creasing her otherwise immaculate brow. Rosamund, elegant in her Sunday best, was the picture of composure, always the perfect lady, always on the edge of propriety. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice as sweet as ever, though there was something in the way her gaze lingered on Rosamund's expression that suggested a deeper interest. Rosamund shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her eyes darting toward the entrance of the village hall, where the bake sale was just beginning. "I do hope everything will go smoothly today, Miss Marple. It's such an important occasion, and, well, with everything going on lately?" Her voice trailed off, but the faintest trace of worry seemed to darken her features. "Everything will go splendidly," Miss Marple said with her usual assurance. "The people of this village have always been most attentive to their duties, especially when it comes to such events. And if I may say so, the hall looks especially charming this year." Rosamund smiled briefly, but it was a thin, forced smile, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. "I do hope you're right. I certainly hope there won't be any complications." "Complications?" Miss Marple echoed lightly, raising her brow. "What sort of complications could there possibly be? It's only a bake sale, after all." "Well, one never knows," Rosamund replied, her eyes briefly flickering to the table where a small display had been arranged. Upon it rested the most delicate of heirlooms, a diamond ring, its sparkling facets catching the light from the nearby windows. Miss Marple's gaze followed Rosamund's and settled on the ring, which was beautifully displayed in a small velvet box. It was a family heirloom, she knew, passed down from the Hawthorn ancestors, and no doubt of great sentimental value. "Ah, yes," Miss Marple said, her tone light but observant. "I had heard you were displaying the Hawthorn heirloom today." Rosamund nodded, her fingers twitching in an almost imperceptible way. "It's important to keep up the tradition, you know. It's been in the family for generations. I thought it would be a nice gesture, but—" She stopped herself, giving Miss Marple a sharp glance. "I do hope it's safe. There are always people who can't be trusted, especially in a crowd like this." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "You seem a little troubled by it, my dear. Perhaps it's the company you're keeping, Rosamund gave a small, forced laugh. "You know how it is. One can never be too cautious, can one? Especially with such a valuable item on display." She paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the velvet box. "It would be terrible if something happened to it. It's the one thing that connects me to my ancestors. It means everything." Miss Marple studied her for a moment, noting the flicker of emotion in Rosamund's eyes. It was a fleeting moment, but Miss Marple caught it, the hint of fear that quickly vanished behind a mask of composure. "There, there," Miss Marple said gently, tapping the arm of her bench. "No need to worry so much, Rosamund. The villagers are trustworthy folk, every one of them." Rosamund nodded, but didn't seem entirely convinced. She gave Miss Marple a quick, tight smile before turning toward the hall. "Well, I mustn't keep you any longer. Enjoy the bake sale, Miss Marple, and do let me know if you find yourself in need of a slice of cake. I'll make sure to save you a piece. I'm sure I'll find something to occupy me," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm, but her eyes already searching the crowd. "But I'll be sure to pop by for a bit of cake if I have the chance." With a final glance at the heirloom ring, Rosamund walked briskly toward the hall, her heels clicking sharply on the cobblestones. Miss Marple sat back on her bench, her hands folded in her lap. The bake sale had only just begun, yet there was already a sense of tension in the air, a tension that Miss Marple, with her usual intuition, recognized all too well. Chapter 2. The Ring Vanishes. The morning wore on in St. Mary's, Crissington, and the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting a golden hue over the village square. From the window of the village hall, Miss Marple could see the crowd spilling out from the tea shop, their voices rising in the usual hum of Sunday chatter. The bake sale was in full swing, the tables laden with rows of freshly baked goods, the scent of sugar and butter thick in the air. The villagers were in high spirits, laughing, sampling cakes, and exchanging pleasantries. But Miss Marple knew better. The stillness in the pit of her stomach told her that something wasn't right. She had taken her time in the hall, quietly observing the bustling event. Most of the villagers seemed to be enjoying themselves, but there was an underlying current of unease that tugged at Miss Marple's keen senses. She had noted George Fallowfield's anxious glances toward the entrance and his frequent, distracted fumbling with the papers he was supposed to be organizing for the bake-off judging. Rosamund Hawthorn had been preoccupied with the heirloom ring, her prized family possession, displayed on a table in front of the main stage. The ring had been carefully placed in its velvet box, and for a time the spectacle had drawn the attention of many curious eyes. It wasn't until just after midday that the first sign of trouble arose. Miss Marple, seated near the back of the hall by the large window, noticed Rosamund hurry toward the table where the heirloom ring had been displayed. Her usually composed features were now twisted in panic. The look of confusion on her face caught the attention of several nearby villagers. Some whispered, others straightened up, sensing that something had shifted. Miss Marple, for her part, watched without haste, letting the scene unfold before her. She knew the villagers too well. They would panic, they would talk, and in their haste they would reveal things they might not have meant to. "Miss Marple!" Rosamund's voice rang out sharply, cutting through the chatter. Her hand trembled slightly as she clutched the corner of the display table. "What's the matter, my dear?" Miss Marple asked calmly, rising from her seat with the grace of a woman who had seen many things in her time but always chose to observe rather than react. "The ring!" Rosamund gasped. "The heirloom ring! It's gone!" There was a pause, a stillness that spread over the crowd. The bake sale, so lively moments before, seemed to come to an abrupt halt as the realization sank in. The heirloom ring, the one item that had drawn attention all morning, was nowhere to be found. "Oh, dear," Miss Marple said softly, her voice carrying a quiet assurance. She had not yet seen the ring in question, but the rising panic in Rosamund's voice spoke volumes. "Are you certain?" Rosamund nodded vigorously. "It was just there. I swear it was there. I turned around for just a moment to speak with George, and when I looked back—" Her voice cracked, but she quickly composed herself. "It's gone, Miss Marple. It simply vanished." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, and within moments the hall was abuzz with questions and speculations. The bake sale, once an innocent occasion, was now shrouded in suspicion. Miss Marple surveyed the room with a cool eye, noticing the shift in the atmosphere. She saw how Rosamund was trembling, her composure cracking under the pressure. And then there was George Fallowfield, who stood by the judging table looking more uncomfortable than Miss Marple had ever seen him. He was fidgeting with the ribbons on his apron, his face pale and drawn, his eyes avoiding Rosamund's gaze. "Is anyone here with me who saw the ring last?" Rosamund asked, her voice rising in pitch as she turned to face the crowd. "I saw it just a moment ago," Mildred Green piped up, pushing her way to the front, her eyes wide with the thrill of gossip. Right there on the table, sparkling in the light. It was certainly there, and then, poof, gone, just like that. George Fallowfield, still standing behind his table, cleared his throat awkwardly. I was near the table earlier, but I didn't see anyone near it when I passed by," he said in a strained voice, his eyes avoiding Rosamund's direct gaze. "George," Rosamund said, her tone now sharp, "are you telling me you didn't see anything?" Nothing unusual? No, George said quickly, shaking his head. Nothing unusual. But Miss Marple noticed how his hands clenched around the edges of his apron. It was a subtle detail, an involuntary gesture, but it spoke volumes. A small clue, easily overlooked by those who were not as attuned to human nature. Miss Marple's gaze flickered toward Hugo Worthington, who was standing near the back of the room. He had remained strangely quiet during all of this, his usual charm absent. His eyes were locked on the empty display table, a thin line of tension around his jaw. His presence at the sale, she knew, had been more than just a social visit. He had been courting Rosamund, or at least trying to. Hugo caught Miss Marple's gaze and smiled, though it was a brittle smile, the kind one might wear when trying to mask uncertainty. Miss Marple, perhaps we should search the hall. It might have simply been misplaced, he suggested, his voice a little too smooth, a little too measured. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. Miss Marple's sharp eyes did not miss the slight flicker of panic that passed through Hugo's expression. He was trying to maintain an air of calm, but his unease was palpable. Indeed, Mr. Worthington, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. I do believe we should search the hall, but I would advise against making assumptions too quickly. By now, the whispers had grown louder, the crowd scattering throughout the hall in search of the missing ring. Everyone was on edge, each villager suspicious of the other. Was it someone from outside the village, or had the thief been someone they had known all along? As Miss Marple moved through the crowd, she took in every detail. The way some of the villagers were glancing at each other, the way Rosamund's eyes kept darting between Hugo and George, the nervous energy of the crowd. It was a tangled web, and one that Miss Marple was determined to untangle in time. But there was no rush. She had all the time in the world to observe. For now, the ring was missing. But Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. Whoever had taken it was far closer than they realized. Chapter 3. Suspicions Arise. The village hall, once a vibrant center of merriment and the scent of freshly baked goods, now stood under a heavy cloud of tension. The once jolly chatter of the bake sale had quieted, replaced by hurried footsteps and hushed voices. The room buzzed with uncertainty, the air thick with suspicion. The heirloom ring, gone, disappeared. Stolen, if you asked some. Misplaced, if you asked others. But one thing was certain. Everyone was a little on edge. Miss Marple had been quietly observing the unfolding chaos, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her mind churning through possibilities. She had seen many such scenes in her time, and each one followed a familiar pattern. The shock, the confusion, and then the inevitable unraveling of the truth. It was just a matter of time before the pieces began to fit together. Rosamund Hawthorn, pale and trembling, had been escorted to the side of the hall by Mildred Green, who was already in full gossip mode. Miss Marple, of course, had overheard their conversation from across the room. It was hard not to. Mildred's voice was impossible to miss. I knew something was wrong, Mildred was saying, her tone as dramatic as ever. Rosamund, bless her heart, always thinks she can trust people too easily. You can't, you know. Not with something that valuable. I don't think it was anyone from the village, Rosamund replied, her voice shaking. The ring was just gone. I swear it was only a moment. Oh dear, no one is saying it's someone from the village, Mildred interrupted. But I'll tell you, it's always the ones who seem the least likely. That baker fellow, for instance. Never trust a man who spends too much time in the kitchen, I say. They've got a lot of time to think, you know." Miss Marple, unable to suppress her curiosity, made her way toward the two women, offering a soft smile as she approached. Rosamund looked up, relief flooding her features when she saw Miss Marple. "I'm sorry to interrupt, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "but perhaps it would be best if I took a closer look at the scene. After all, there's no need for further panic just yet." "Of course, Miss Marple," Rosamund replied, her voice hoarse. "I just don't understand. Where could it have gone?" Mildred eyed Miss Marple with a skeptical glance, but said nothing. She had long held a suspicion of Miss Marple's subtle ways, but today she had no choice but to be quiet. Miss Marple's presence commanded attention, and even Mildred could see that. Miss Marple took her time, surveying the table where the ring had been placed. It was a simple affair, just a small velvet-lined display box, now empty, the faint indentations of the missing ring still visible inside. There were no signs of struggle, no signs of a break-in. If the ring had been stolen, the thief had been discreet. Too discreet, Miss Marple thought. Her gaze drifted to the surrounding area, the tables with their cakes, the chairs arranged haphazardly, the cluster of people now whispering in groups. It was then that Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught sight of something small but significant. Near the edge of the table, tucked beneath a paper napkin, was a small crumpled scrap of paper. She bent down slightly to pick it up, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was rushed, almost frantic, but legible. It read, "Get the ring." "Don't fail," Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she examined the note. It was short, urgent, and meant for someone in particular. But who? The meaning was clear. Someone had been ordered to take the ring. But by whom? And why? Her mind began to race, sifting through the few details she had so far. She tucked the note into her pocket and straightened up, her gaze sweeping over the hall once again. George Fallowfield, the baker, was standing by the window, looking out at the gathering crowd. His expression was unreadable, but his posture, tense, rigid, spoke volumes. He was watching the proceedings with more than just casual interest. His eyes flicked from Rosamund to the table, then to the group of villagers. There was something in his manner that made Miss Marple uneasy. She moved closer, her steps measured but quiet. George didn't seem to notice her approach until she was almost beside him. "Good day, Mr. Fallowfield," Miss Marple said softly, her tone light but probing. George started at the sound of her voice, turning to face her with a strained smile. "Oh, Miss Marple. Didn't see you there." "I dare say most people don't," Miss Marple replied, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "It's a gift, you see." "I'm usually the last to be noticed." George's smile faltered, and for a moment there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He quickly cleared his throat, adjusting his apron. "Yes, well, I've been busy. You know, with the judging and all, lots to do." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her gaze lingering on him for a beat too long. "But tell me, Mr. Fallowfield, did you happen to see anyone near the display table just before the ring disappeared?" George stiffened, and Miss Marple could feel the tension rising in him. No. I was busy. I didn't see anything unusual. I didn't even notice when the ring went missing, to be honest." Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. "That's curious, isn't it? Considering you were standing not far from the table. Just a bit before the disappearance, wasn't it?" George shifted uncomfortably. "I suppose so. But like I said, I didn't see anything. And yet," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "you seem rather agitated. Tell me, Mr. Fallowfield, have you seen Rosamund's family heirloom before?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment George's face betrayed something, a flicker of recognition, a slight tightening of the jaw. "Of course, I've seen it," he said, his voice a little too sharp. "Everyone in the village knows about it." "I see," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "And yet you seem quite tense about it. One might think you had a more personal interest in it than mere village curiosity." George's lips pressed into a thin line, and he glanced nervously over at Rosamund, who was now being comforted by Mildred. He hesitated before answering, but Miss Marple had already seen enough. There was something more here, something he was hiding. "Well," Miss Marple said, stepping back, "I'll let you get on with your duties, Mr. Fallowfield. But do remember, everyone here is a potential suspect. No one is above suspicion, not even the most trusted of us." George stiffened at her words, his face flushing. But before he could reply, Miss Marple had already turned away, her attention shifting to the next suspect. Hugo Worthington stood at the far end of the hall, his posture relaxed, yet his eyes, too, alert. He had not moved since Miss Marple had last noticed him. His silence spoke volumes, and Miss Marple had no intention of letting it go unexamined. Chapter 4. The First Round of Interviews. By the time the clock struck 2, the mood in the village hall had shifted from anxious to downright tense. Miss Marple had observed all the villagers present, carefully watching their reactions and listening to their hushed conversations. The chatter that had once filled the air now seemed muted, as though everyone were holding their breath, waiting for the missing heirloom ring to reappear, or for someone to crack under the pressure. Miss Marple, however, remained unruffled. She knew better than to rush to conclusions. A missing object, especially something as valuable as a family heirloom, would naturally cause a stir. But the more she observed, the more she sensed that the disappearance of the ring was only the surface of a deeper, more complicated matter. The first step in Miss Marple's investigation was always to speak directly with the people involved, those who had been closest to the scene, those whose actions, in her experienced eyes, might hold the key to unlocking the truth. Her first stop was Rosamund Hawthorn, who had returned to the table where the ring had once rested, her hands trembling slightly as she fiddled with the velvet box that remained on display. The box, of course, was now empty, save for the faint indentation where the ring had been. Rosamund's eyes were red-rimmed, but she held herself together with the kind of stiff upper lip that only a woman of her background could manage. "Miss Marple," Rosamund said when she saw her approach, her voice fragile but controlled, "I don't know what to think. Everything seemed fine, and then this. I can't believe it. How could it just vanish like that?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "I'm sure it's quite a shock, my dear. But the sooner we gather our wits and take stock of the situation, the sooner we'll have the answers we're looking for." Rosamund nodded, but her eyes remained distant, unfocused. Miss Marple could see that her mind was racing, torn between concern for the heirloom and fear of what might happen to her family's reputation. Rosamund had always been more concerned with appearances than with the truth, a trait that Miss Marple had noticed from the very beginning. "You said earlier, Rosamund," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle but firm, "that you saw the ring just moments before it disappeared. Can you recall anything unusual at that time? Anything that seemed out of place?" Rosamund hesitated, then shook her head. "No, Nothing at all. I didn't notice anything strange. But when I turned back, it was gone. Just like that. And you were not alone at the table? Miss Marple pressed. No, I wasn't, Rosamund answered quickly. There were a few people nearby, of course. Mildred Green was standing just a few feet away. And George, he was talking to someone near the judging table. But I don't think anyone could have taken it so quickly. George, Miss Marple repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly. Yes, I did notice Mr. Fallowfield seemed distracted. Was he in a hurry, perhaps? I don't know, Rosamund said, shaking her head. He was acting strange, yes, but then again, George is always a little nervous. It's just his way. He's a good man, though, always willing to help. I trust him. Miss Marple watched Rosamund carefully, noting the way her gaze darted to the judging table where George had been standing. I see, she said slowly. I'll speak with him again, of course. But Rosamund, you must remember, the thief, if there is one, could be anyone. Even someone you trust. Rosamund paled slightly at the words. You think it could be someone from the village? It's possible, Miss Marple replied, but let's not jump to conclusions. For now, I suggest we speak with the others who were present. Perhaps someone noticed something we did not. With a final reassuring smile, Miss Marple excused herself and moved on, her mind already whirring with new thoughts. She had spoken with Rosamund, but it was clear that the woman wasn't being entirely forthcoming. There was something in her manner that suggested more than just anxiety over a missing heirloom. Miss Marple was careful not to overlook the smallest detail. Next, Miss Marple made her way to George Fallowfield, who had once again found his way to the window. He was gazing out at the village square, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He appeared to be lost in thought, though whether it was genuine contemplation or simply a facade, Miss Marple wasn't sure. Mr. Fallowfield, she said, her voice as calm as ever. How are you holding up, my dear? I imagine this is quite unsettling. George turned slowly, his face hardening slightly at the sight of her. He was trying to maintain composure, but Miss Marple could see the tension in his posture. Oh, Miss Marple, he said, his voice tight. I'm fine, just a little shaken. It's not every day you have something like this happen. Miss Marple smiled softly, her eyes twinkling with quiet understanding. Indeed, it's quite a shock. But I'm sure we'll get to the bottom of it soon enough. I'm just speaking with everyone who was nearby. You, of course, were at the judging table. Yes, George said, nodding. I was. But I didn't see anything suspicious. The table was a bit crowded. There were a lot of people milling about. And you didn't see anyone near the display table? Miss Marple asked, her tone innocent but probing. George shook his head quickly. No, no one, not even Rosamund? Miss Marple pressed, noting how George flinched at the mention of her name. His eyes darted to the corner of the hall where Rosamund was still seated, her head lowered. I didn't see her. No. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on him, her expression unreadable. That's odd, isn't it, Mr. Fallowfield? You were standing nearby, yet you didn't see anything. No one near the table, no one acting suspicious. George's fingers clenched around the folds of his apron, and Miss Marple caught the briefest flicker of nervousness in his eyes. I told you I didn't see anything. Miss Marple smiled gently, but her eyes were sharp. Of course, Mr. Fallowfield, of course. With that, she turned away, leaving George to his thoughts. It was clear to her now George Fallowfield was hiding something, and Miss Marple would not let him get away with it. Chapter 5. A Web of Lies. The village hall had grown quieter as the afternoon wore on, the chatter now reduced to muted conversations and the occasional clink of a teacup. The earlier chaos surrounding the missing heirloom had settled into a tense calm, but the air was thick with suspicion, and Miss Marple could feel it all around her. The bake sale had become an event no one would soon forget, not for the pastries or the cakes, but for the mystery that now hung over it. Miss Marple, however, was not one to be easily intimidated by tension. She had dealt with far more intricate mysteries over the years, and she knew that patience was key. The truth, like a puzzle, could only be solved one piece at a time. She had already spoken with Rosamund and George Fallowfield, but there was more to be uncovered. And then there was Hugo Worthington, who had remained somewhat aloof throughout the entire ordeal. He had not been as forthcoming as Miss Marple would have liked, and his behavior was starting to raise more questions than answers. As she walked through the hall, Miss Marple took note of the way people had started to cluster in small groups. Rosamund, still shaken by the disappearance of the ring, had retreated into herself, sitting at one of the side tables and quietly accepting comfort from Mildred Green, who was doing her best to play the role of the concerned friend. Meanwhile, George had gone back to his station, organizing the bake-off entries with nervous energy, avoiding eye contact with anyone who came too close. Hugo Worthington, however, was still standing at the far end of the room, leaning against the wall with a relaxed posture that didn't quite match the tension of the situation. He was watching everything with the keen interest of someone who had a stake in the outcome, but didn't want to show his hand. His charm was usually effortless, but today it seemed forced, a thin mask over something more uncomfortable. Miss Marple made her way over to him, her steps measured and deliberate. She had seen enough to know that he was one of the key players in this little drama. "Hugo," she greeted him softly, her tone polite but filled with an underlying question. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Hugo looked up at her, his easy smile in place. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Just taking in the scene. A bit of a disaster, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple smiled back, though her gaze was sharp. "Yes, it's certainly not the sort of thing one expects at a bake sale. The disappearance of such a valuable item does tend to overshadow the cakes, doesn't it?" Hugo's smile faltered slightly, and he shifted his weight against the wall. "It's terribly unfortunate. I'm sure the villagers will sort it out soon enough." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Though I wonder, Hugo, did you happen to see anything unusual earlier? Perhaps when the ring went missing?" Hugo's eyes flicked briefly to the display table, then back to Miss Marple. He was quick to cover his unease with a casual chuckle. "I've been busy, you know. Talking to Rosamund, chatting with the villagers, helping with the setup. Didn't see anything out of the ordinary." Miss Marple didn't miss the way his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his coat. "I see. Just so much happening, I suppose. But you must have noticed the ring on the table before it vanished, surely?" Hugo hesitated for a moment too long. "I may have," he said slowly, "but I wasn't paying much attention. I've never had much interest in jewelry, if I'm being honest." "I see," Miss Marple said again, her voice thoughtful. "So you didn't notice anything, not even when Rosamund seemed so distraught?" "I didn't notice her being distraught, if I'm being honest," Hugo replied quickly, his tone suddenly defensive. "I think everyone was a bit shaken up. It's just a ring, after all." Miss Marple's eyes were calm but intense as she studied him. A family heirloom, Hugo. A ring passed down for generations. I would think such a thing would mean something to her. To the village, too, I imagine. Hugo shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. He cleared his throat, his voice now more clipped. Well, I'm sure it's terribly important to her, but we can't lose our heads over it, can we? A bit of missing jewelry isn't the end of the world. Miss Marple smiled, though the smile did not reach her eyes. Of course not. But I'm sure Rosamund would appreciate your support in this matter, as a close friend. Hugo's eyes flicked toward Rosamund, who was still seated with Mildred at the side of the room. He looked back at Miss Marple with a tight-lipped expression. Of course. I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. Miss Marple studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. Thank you, Hugo. You've been most helpful. As she walked away, she couldn't help but feel that Hugo was hiding something he didn't want her to discover. His defensiveness, his avoidance of Rosamund, the slight tension in his voice when discussing the ring, these were all clues, and Miss Marple knew that no one, not even the charming Hugo Worthington, could hide the truth forever. Miss Marple made her way over to the side table where Rosamund sat with Mildred. Rosamund's eyes were red, but she looked up as Miss Marple approached, her expression a mixture of gratitude and nervousness. Miss Marple, she said softly, her voice shaking slightly, I can't help but feel as if I've failed my family. How could this happen? Miss Marple smiled gently, though her mind was already working. There's no need for such distress, Rosamund. We will find the ring. But tell me, did anyone else seem to be paying an unusual amount of attention to the display table? Did you see anyone linger near it longer than necessary? Rosamund thought for a moment, then shook her head. No, I don't think so. Everyone was busy, talking, moving about. But, I don't know, Miss Marple, it just doesn't make sense. Why would anyone take it? Sometimes, Miss Marple said slowly, people are motivated by things we don't see. But I think we'll have the answer soon enough. I just need you to trust me, Rosamund. We'll get to the bottom of this. Rosamund nodded, though her gaze was distant. Miss Marple had no doubt that the pressure was wearing on her, but there was something in Rosamund's manner that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Miss Marple couldn't put her finger on it just yet, but she was certain that the truth was closer than it seemed. As she left Rosamund's side, Miss Marple glanced once more at George Fallowfield. He was still busy at his table, but there was something different about him now. He was speaking with a man Miss Marple didn't recognize, someone who seemed oddly out of place in the village. The stranger was tall and dressed in a dark suit, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His presence alone sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. Perhaps, she murmured to herself, this is the missing piece. Chapter 6. The Baker's Anxious Behavior. The village hall had grown eerily quiet in the hours since the disappearance of the heirloom ring. The usual buzz of conversation had dwindled into uneasy silence, punctuated by occasional whispers and the rustle of paper napkins as villagers discreetly exchanged their suspicions. Everyone was on edge, their eyes darting from one person to the next, as though they were all waiting for someone to crack and reveal the truth. Miss Marple, however, remained composed. She had seen such scenes unfold many times before. This was not the first time a small-town event had been disrupted by a mystery. And yet, there was something about this particular case that intrigued her more than usual. The missing heirloom, the strange behavior of the suspects, and the recent appearance of a mysterious stranger had woven a complex web that Miss Marple was determined to untangle. Her next stop was George Fallowfield, the baker. He had been a figure of some concern in Miss Marple's observations. His anxiety had been noticeable from the start, but it had only grown as the day went on. His nervous energy seemed almost contagious, and Miss Marple knew that it wasn't just the heirloom that was bothering him. There was something else, something deeper. George was standing near the judging table now, his hand shaking slightly as he arranged the entries for the bake-off. His usual confidence in the kitchen seemed absent, replaced by a distracted, jittery demeanor. Miss Marple approached him quietly, taking care not to startle him. "Mr. Fallowfield," she said softly, her voice light and nonchalant. "How are you faring today?" George looked up, his face pale and drawn. For a moment he didn't seem to recognize her, his eyes unfocused. Then, as though remembering himself, he gave a tight smile. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. "I'm fine, just a bit tired, that's all." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp and penetrating. "Tired, you say? I imagine the excitement of the day has taken its toll on all of us. But I noticed you've been rather preoccupied since the ring went missing. Is everything really all right, George?" George's hands twitched, and he quickly straightened a plate of biscuits, his eyes avoiding hers. "I'm fine." "Really, Miss Marple? Just trying to keep things together, you know. It's a busy day, and with the bake-off and everything." He trailed off, his words faltering, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Miss Marple stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "You seem quite anxious. Is it the ring, or something else, perhaps?" George's face tightened, and he took a deep breath as though steadying himself. "I've already told you I didn't see anything, Miss Marple." "I didn't take the ring, if that's what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Fallowfield," Miss Marple said gently. "But it's interesting, isn't it? You seem more concerned than anyone else. Why, I wonder?" George's eyes widened, his lips parting as if to say something, but then he hesitated. He glanced toward Rosamund, who was still sitting at the side table, and quickly looked away. It's just that I don't like these sorts of situations. It's all so messy. People gossiping, accusations flying. It's all just too much." Miss Marple's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Yes, gossip can be most inconvenient, especially when it's not based on fact. But, Mr. Fallowfield, it's the facts we're after." "The truth." George shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around the room. He seemed desperate to avoid the conversation, as though the very mention of the truth made him uneasy. "I'm not sure what you expect from me, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "I'm just a baker. I don't get involved in these things." Miss Marple gave him a long, searching look. "No, of course not. But you were involved today, weren't you? Near the table, speaking with the others. And yet you didn't see anything. Nothing at all." George's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment Miss Marple thought he might say something more. But instead he merely nodded and muttered, "I didn't see anything. I've told you everything I know." Miss Marple smiled softly and patted his arm lightly. "Of course, Mr. Fallowfield, I appreciate your time. I'll leave you to your work." As Miss Marple turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that George Fallowfield was hiding something. His nervousness, his avoidance of direct answers. There was more to it than mere anxiety over the missing ring. But for now, she would have to be patient. She would find out what he was hiding, even if it took time. The afternoon wore on, and Miss Marple continued to observe the other suspects. Rosamund had been avoiding eye contact with anyone for some time, and Mildred Green, who had been more than happy to gossip earlier, had grown quiet as well. But the arrival of the stranger had not gone unnoticed by Miss Marple, and it was now the stranger's presence that occupied her thoughts. The man was still standing in the corner of the room, speaking with no one in particular. His dark suit and shadowed face made him stand out in the otherwise familiar crowd of villagers. But it wasn't just his appearance that made him odd. It was his air of detachment, as though he didn't belong there at all. He had no clear reason for being at the event, and yet he was here, watching everyone carefully. Miss Marple knew that such a man could not be ignored. With a small sigh, Miss Marple made her way over to him. "Excuse me, sir," she said in her usual soft voice, making the stranger start slightly. "I couldn't help but notice you've been standing here for some time, observing everyone. You're not from around here, are you?" The man looked at her sharply, his eyes flicking to her face, then quickly looking away. He hesitated for a moment before answering in a low, almost gravelly voice. "No, I'm not from the village," he said. "Just passing through?" Miss Marple studied him carefully. There was something about the way he spoke, something measured, deliberate. He wasn't just a passer-by. He knew something, and Miss Marple could sense it. "I see," she said, her tone pleasant but probing. "And what brings you to our little bake sale, if I may ask?" The man shifted uncomfortably. "Just curious. I've heard a lot about St. Mary's Crissington. Thought I'd see it for myself." Miss Marple's smile remained unchanged, but her eyes were piercing. "Curious indeed. I do hope you're enjoying the event." The man nodded quickly, then seemed eager to retreat. Yes, I've seen enough. Thank you." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Miss Marple watched him go, her brow furrowing. There was no mistaking it now. This stranger was involved in some way. His presence here was too calculated, too purposeful. The pieces were slowly beginning to fall into place. But the puzzle was far from complete, and Miss Marple knew it would take more than just observation to unravel the truth. She had to act, and soon. Chapter 7. The Love Triangle. The village hall had settled into a sort of uneasy calm. The murmurs of the crowd had died down, replaced by the occasional scrape of chairs and the soft clinking of teacups. Miss Marple could sense the mounting tension in the room, whispers about the missing heirloom, hushed conversations about the mysterious stranger, and more than one sideways glance exchanged among the villagers. There was something distinctly different about the atmosphere now. What had begun as a quaint village event was quickly turning into something much darker. Everyone was a suspect, and Miss Marple knew that the truth could be hidden in the smallest of details. The ring might have disappeared, but the web of secrets, jealousy, and fear that had been woven around it was now becoming clearer with each passing moment. Miss Marple's next stop was near the corner where George Fallowfield was still standing. His posture had changed slightly since their last conversation, but his nervousness remained. He had been speaking briefly with the stranger, but when Miss Marple had approached, George quickly turned away, avoiding her gaze. She could tell he was trying to distance himself from the entire situation, but his uneasy manner was telling in itself. His movements were too stiff, too deliberate. He was no longer simply a concerned bystander. He was hiding something, and Miss Marple intended to find out what it was. But it wasn't just George who piqued Miss Marple's interest. The more she observed, the more she realized there was another person at the heart of the mystery, someone whose presence had been hidden in plain sight. Rosamund Hawthorn. It was subtle at first, but Miss Marple had noticed the tension between Rosamund and Hugo Worthington. The two had exchanged more than a few strained glances since the heirloom went missing. There was something unspoken between them, something that, Miss Marple realized, could be the key to understanding the theft. Miss Marple had watched Rosamund closely earlier. Her anxiousness had been palpable, her anxiety obvious. But what Miss Marple had missed before, she could now see clearly. There was a jealousy, a possessiveness in the way Rosamund had glared at Hugo, especially when he had been speaking with Mildred Green. The two had been laughing, sharing stories, and whispering among themselves, something that did not go unnoticed by Miss Marple. Rosamund was, after all, a woman with pride, and Hugo had been courting her. At least, that's what she had led everyone to believe. But Miss Marple could sense that something was amiss. Perhaps the missing ring wasn't the only thing that had been taken. Perhaps there was a deeper betrayal at play, one that had nothing to do with the heirloom itself, but with the relationships that had been built around it. Miss Marple made her way over to Rosamund, who was seated at a small table in the corner, her hands nervously clutching a lace handkerchief. Her gaze was fixed on the spot where the ring had once rested, her expression a mix of worry and frustration. "Rosamund," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "I hope you're feeling a bit better now." "I know this must be quite a shock." Rosamund looked up at Miss Marple, her face pale and drawn. She forced a tight smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, I don't know what to do. I've never felt so lost. The ring, it means everything to me, my family's legacy, and now it's gone." "I understand," Miss Marple said, taking a seat across from her. "But I wonder, my dear, if there's more to this than just the loss of the heirloom." Rosamund looked startled, her hand clenching around the handkerchief. "What do you mean?" "I've noticed," Miss Marple continued softly, "that you seem quite distressed, not just over the ring, but over someone else's behavior. Hugo Worthington, for example. There's something in the way you look at him. You seem upset, Rosamund. Why is that?" Rosamund's face flushed, and for the first time Miss Marple saw a flicker of genuine emotion behind her usually composed exterior. She lowered her gaze to the handkerchief, twisting it in her hands. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple," Rosamund said, her voice tight. "Hugo and I have been friends for a long time. He's always been supportive of me. But you're not just friends, are you?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "You and Hugo have been more than just friends, haven't you?" Rosamund looked up sharply, her eyes widening in surprise. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything, Rosamund," Miss Marple said gently. "I'm simply asking you to think carefully. Hugo has been acting strangely, hasn't he? He's been distant with you today. And he was speaking with Mildred Green earlier, wasn't he? I noticed a certain tension between them." Rosamund's eyes flicked to the corner of the room where Hugo and Mildred were speaking again. Mildred had a wide grin on her face, and Hugo's body language had changed. His usual charm now seemed a little forced, a little too eager. "I don't care about what they're talking about," Rosamund said quickly, her voice tight. "It's not important." Miss Marple watched her closely, noting the way Rosamund's fingers dug into the fabric of her handkerchief. "No, it's not important, is it?" she said softly. Not unless there's something more between them than meets the eye. Rosamund's eyes darkened, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of something almost possessive, something deeper than simple jealousy. "You're wrong," Rosamund said, her voice trembling. "I don't care about Hugo." "Not any more." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing as she pieced the puzzle together. There it was, the motive, hidden in plain sight. Rosamund's relationship with Hugo had clearly been more complicated than she had let on. And now the jealousy, the anger, it all made sense. Miss Marple stood up, her mind racing. "Thank you, Rosamund," she said softly. "I think I know what I need to do next." Chapter 8. The gossip flows. The atmosphere in the village hall had shifted once again, the tense air hanging like a thick fog that refused to lift. The event that had once been a lively gathering was now a quiet investigation, the crowd reduced to whispers and furtive glances. The scent of cakes and pastries still lingered, but the warmth of the community was gone, replaced by the cold chill of suspicion. Miss Marple had spent the last few hours observing, listening, and quietly weaving the threads of this tangled mystery. She had uncovered more than she had expected, but there was still something elusive, something that didn't quite fit. Rosamund's jealousy toward Hugo, the strange behavior of George, the presence of the mysterious stranger, all of it pointed toward a deeper, more intricate web of lies. But Miss Marple knew that in every village there was one person who knew everything, and that person was almost always the last to be suspected. Mildred Green, the village gossip. Miss Marple knew that Mildred would be more than willing to share her thoughts on the matter, whether Miss Marple wanted to hear them or not. Mildred, who ran the village's small tea shop, had an ear for everyone's secrets, and her sharp tongue was never far from the latest bit of village drama. Miss Marple found her near the refreshment table, chatting animatedly with a small group of women. Mildred's voice, always a touch too loud, carried across the room as she recounted some amusing and entirely fabricated story about a local farmhand and his sheep. Miss Marple smiled politely, waiting for the conversation to turn in her direction. It didn't take long. "Ah, Miss Marple," Mildred said, spotting her from across the room. "Just the person I wanted to see. You've been so quiet today. You're usually more involved in the hustle and bustle. What's going on with you? Not your usual self, I'd say." Miss Marple approached, her smile warm, but her eyes watchful. "Oh, you know me, Mildred." "I prefer to observe, but I must say it's a rather quiet afternoon. Not much excitement after all the commotion earlier." "Oh, excitement? What excitement?" Mildred's eyes twinkled with mischief. "You know, I don't think anyone's ever had a bake sale quite like this one. It's certainly memorable." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "You don't think the disappearance of that ring has anything to do with the excitement, do you?" Mildred laughed, her voice a little too shrill. "Oh, Miss Marple, you do have a way of seeing the world, don't you?" Yes, the ring is certainly a mystery, but don't you think it's a bit theatrical? I mean, it's just a bit of jewelry. You wouldn't expect such a fuss over something so material." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm, "but some things hold sentimental value. And it's not just the ring that's causing a stir, is it?" Mildred's smile faltered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. "Well, of course the ring has caused quite a bit of fuss, but you know, there's always something more beneath the surface, isn't there? People are strange, Miss Marple. You can't always take them at face value." "I agree," Miss Marple said softly. "People can be very unpredictable. But I wonder, Mildred, if you've noticed anything unusual today. Anything that might shed some light on what happened." Mildred's eyes darted to the corner of the room where Rosamund was still sitting, her hands wringing her handkerchief. "Unusual? Well, I'm not one to gossip, but you know how it is. There's always something going on, isn't there? You know, the way George has been acting today, it's like he's hiding something. I wouldn't be surprised if he's involved in all this, you know. He's always been a bit jumpy." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze steady. "Yes, I've noticed George's nerves. But you seem quite certain he's hiding something. Why would you say that?" "Well, I've known George for years, and I've seen how he reacts when he's guilty about something," Mildred said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "He's always so defensive, and when he's nervous, he doesn't hide it well. You saw how he was acting earlier, didn't you? Jumping at shadows. It's obvious he knows more than he's letting on. He's always been a bit too eager to be helpful, if you ask me." Miss Marple smiled, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. "I see. And what about Hugo Worthington? You've spoken to him today, haven't you?" Mildred's face immediately hardened at the mention of Hugo's name. "Hugo? Oh, I've spoken to him all right, and let me tell you, Miss Marple, I don't trust him one bit. He's a charmer, isn't he? Always smiling, always making everyone feel like they're the most important person in the room. But I know better. Men like that don't have your best interests at heart." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with curiosity. "What makes you say that, Mildred?" "Because I've seen how he's been looking at Rosamund," Mildred said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "and not just today. For weeks now, he's been playing her like a fiddle. He's got his sights set on her fortune, mark my words. And now, with the ring gone, he thinks he's in the clear." Miss Marple's mind raced as she absorbed Mildred's words. The relationships between Rosamund, George, and Hugo were more tangled than she had originally thought. Mildred's sharp observations and her willingness to share details, often laced with a hint of exaggeration, were invaluable. But Miss Marple knew she had to take everything with a grain of salt. Gossip, after all, was rarely the full truth. "Thank you, Mildred," Miss Marple said, standing up. "You've been most helpful." "Oh, any time, miss." "Marple," Mildred said with a sly grin, "you know I'm always happy to help. Just don't go believing everything you hear, all right?" Miss Marple smiled politely, her thoughts already moving to the next step in the investigation. There was still more to uncover, but now she had a clearer sense of the dynamics at play. The jealousy, the rivalry, the hidden motives. These were the forces behind the missing heirloom. But there was still one thing Miss Marple couldn't shake: the presence of the mysterious stranger. He had been lurking in the background, watching everyone closely, and Miss Marple was certain that he knew more than he was letting on. As Miss Marple walked away, she could feel the pieces of the puzzle coming together. But one question remained unanswered. Who was the stranger, and what role did he play in the theft? Chapter 9. The puzzle pieces fit together. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the village hall. The once bustling room had quieted to an almost oppressive stillness. The bake sale, intended to be a cheerful village tradition, had now become a tense gathering, a room full of suspects, all with their own stories to tell, but none willing to share the whole truth. Miss Marple stood near the edge of the room, her gaze sweeping over the assembled villagers. Rosamund was still sitting at her table, her face pale and strained, as she fidgeted with her handkerchief. George Fallowfield, though visibly uncomfortable, had resumed his duties with the bake-off, though his nervous glances were too frequent to ignore. Hugo Worthington, who had been so charming earlier, was now pacing near the back of the hall, his face drawn and his smile gone. But it wasn't these familiar faces that Miss Marple focused on. No, it was the man standing in the far corner of the room, the mysterious stranger whose presence had been haunting the edges of the gathering. Since their brief exchange earlier, Miss Marple had seen him a few more times, always standing alone, always watching, but never speaking to anyone. He didn't belong here. It was time to confront him. With deliberate steps, Miss Marple made her way across the room, her eyes never leaving the man. He was tall, his face shadowed by the brim of his dark hat. His suit was immaculate, though somewhat out of place in the otherwise casual atmosphere of the village event. He had been watching the proceedings with an air of detachment, but Miss Marple knew better. There was no such thing as detachment when one was involved in a mystery. He was involved, and Miss Marple intended to find out how. "Good evening, sir," Miss Marple said, as she reached the corner where the man stood. Her voice was calm and polite, but it carried an unspoken challenge. The stranger looked up, startled, as if he hadn't expected anyone to approach him. His eyes flickered momentarily before he straightened, offering her a polite nod. "Good evening, madam," he said, his voice low and smooth, with a trace of an accent that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. "Is there something I can assist you with?" Miss Marple smiled warmly, though her eyes were sharp. "I was just wondering what brought you to our little village gathering. I must admit, I don't recall seeing you at any of our past events." The man's lips tightened ever so slightly, and for a moment Miss Marple could see a flicker of tension in his demeanor. "I'm simply passing through," he said, his tone a little too measured, a little too rehearsed. "I've heard much about St. Mary's Crissington, and thought I'd see it for myself." "A charming little village." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, her voice gentle but probing. "A charming village, yes. But surely you must have some reason for being here today, especially at such a peculiar moment. The disappearance of an heirloom, for example, tends to draw a certain kind of attention." The man's eyes shifted again, briefly narrowing as if assessing her. Then, with a soft chuckle, he took a step back, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. "I assure you, madam, I have no interest in the ring. I'm merely a visitor, as I said. I thought to enjoy the local color, nothing more." Miss Marple studied him carefully, her smile remaining fixed in place. "How curious. You've been here for most of the day, yet you haven't interacted with anyone. No interest in the pastries, no desire to speak to the others. Most visitors to a village event would be keen to do both." The stranger hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the others in the room before returning to Miss Marple. "I suppose I'm just a bit of an observer," he said smoothly, but Miss Marple could hear the hint of nervousness beneath his words. "I prefer to keep to myself." "I see," Miss Marple said, her tone soft but firm. "And yet you've been keeping a very close eye on the proceedings, watching every movement, every conversation." The stranger stiffened slightly, his eyes darting toward the door. "I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple stepped a little closer, her voice lowering. "You've been watching everyone in this room, haven't you? You know something about the heirloom, something you're not telling me, and if I had to guess, I would say you've been here before." The stranger's face hardened. For the first time, Miss Marple saw a flicker of anger in his eyes, quickly masked by a forced smile. "You're mistaken, madam. I've no idea what you're talking about." Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "I think you do, and I think you're the one who took the ring. But you're not the only one who's hiding something, are you? You're not the only one who's been watching and waiting." The stranger's expression faltered, and for a split second he looked cornered. Then, with a sudden movement, he straightened, his composure returning. "I believe I've said all I need to say, madam. I'm not the one you're looking for." Before Miss Marple could respond, the stranger turned and quickly exited the hall, disappearing into the growing shadows outside. Miss Marple stood still for a moment, watching him go. She had known it. There was something about him, something that didn't sit right. He hadn't come to enjoy the event. He hadn't come to sample the cakes or make small talk with the villagers. No, he had come for something else. And now, with his quick departure, Miss Marple was more certain than ever that he was involved in the disappearance of the heirloom. But there was more to the story. Miss Marple had seen enough to know that this was just the beginning. The pieces were slowly coming together, and she had no doubt that the final revelation would be even more surprising than she had imagined. As she turned to head back toward the others, Miss Marple's mind was already working, already connecting the dots. The stranger's hasty departure was just the first clue. Now it was time to piece together the puzzle and find out what he knew about the missing ring. Chapter 10. The Final Revelation. The light outside was fading, and the village hall seemed to hum with a low, almost uncomfortable energy. The earlier chaos had subsided, and now the villagers were left to stew in their thoughts. Suspicion, fear, and confusion clouding their interactions. The day that had begun with so much excitement was now ending with unease, as if the very air in the hall had thickened, waiting for someone to crack. Miss Marple, however, remained as calm and composed as ever. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align in her mind, and she knew it was time to bring everything to light. The strangers, the betrayals, the hidden motives, all of it had been building to this moment. As she observed the remaining suspects, Miss Marple's mind flicked back to the events of the day: George Fallowfield's nervous energy, Rosamund's veiled jealousy and possessiveness, the mysterious stranger who had been lurking at the edges of the event. And then there was Hugo Worthington, who, Miss Marple now realized, had played a far more central role in this drama than he had let on. Miss Marple stood at the back of the room, her sharp eyes sweeping over the gathered crowd once again. Rosamund, still pale, sat at her table, but now there was a determined look in her eyes. Hugo was nearby, speaking with Mildred Green, his charm seemingly back in full force. But Miss Marple noticed how his glances kept darting toward Rosamund, his smile forced. The stranger had long since disappeared into the shadows, and Miss Marple felt a sense of finality in his departure. It was clear now that he had played a role in the theft, but he was just a pawn in a much larger game. She took a slow, measured breath and moved toward the center of the room. It was time to confront the suspects. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple's voice rang out softly but clearly, commanding immediate attention. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward her. "I've spent much of the day observing, speaking with various people, and considering the facts. And I believe I now know the truth." Rosamund stiffened, her eyes wide with anxiety, but Miss Marple continued with an air of quiet confidence. "The disappearance of the heirloom ring was not an accident," Miss Marple said, her gaze moving over the group. Nor was it the result of a random theft. It was a carefully orchestrated scheme, a plan devised by someone with both the motive and the opportunity. George Fallowfield shifted nervously, his hands twitching at his sides. He opened his mouth to speak, but Miss Marple held up a hand, silencing him. "No, Mr. Fallowfield," Miss Marple continued. "You're not the one behind this, but you know something, don't you? You've been covering for someone." George's face paled, and he stepped back, looking guilty but not surprised. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Miss." Marple's eyes narrowed. "You were involved, but only in part. The real mastermind behind this scheme, the one who manipulated everything, is none other than Hugo Worthington." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room as all eyes turned to Hugo. He stiffened, his smile faltering for the first time that day. Miss Marple's sharp gaze never left him. "Hugo," Miss Marple said softly, "you've been playing a game all along. You've been charming Rosamund, pretending to be her concerned friend, but all the while you were setting the stage for your own gain." Hugo's facade cracked, and he took a step forward, his voice strained. "What are you talking about, Miss Marple? I didn't steal anything. I've been nothing but kind to Rosamund. I've been a good friend." Miss Marple smiled, her tone calm but cutting. "Kind? Perhaps. But it wasn't friendship that motivated you, was it? You were after Rosamund's fortune all along, and when you realized that the heirloom ring, something so valuable to her, was the key to unlocking her family's wealth, you decided to make it disappear. But you needed an accomplice." At these words, Rosamund's face flushed with anger. You've been using me," she gasped, her voice trembling with shock. Hugo glanced at her briefly, but his gaze flickered away, avoiding her eyes. I never meant for things to go this far," he muttered. "I thought I could just take the ring, sell it, and leave. But I didn't mean to hurt you, Rosamund. I never wanted this." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her eyes cold. "No, Hugo. You didn't mean to hurt anyone, but you were so focused on the ring, on the wealth, that you failed to see the consequences of your actions." "But how did you know?" Rosamund whispered, still in shock. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It was the little things, Rosamund. The way Hugo seemed so disinterested in you today, the way he turned away when you needed him most. He was pretending to be the concerned suitor, but in reality, he was more concerned with the ring." The pieces of the puzzle were coming together now. Miss Marple had noticed the smallest details, the subtle shifts in behavior, the small contradictions that added up to something much larger. And in the end, it all pointed to Hugo. "Hugo, you weren't the only one involved, though," Miss Marple continued. "You had help. The stranger, the man who was lurking at the edges of the event, was your accomplice. He had the connections to sell the ring, and he knew how to cover his tracks. But he was only a tool in your scheme, Hugo." Hugo's face darkened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple could see that his resolve was crumbling. "I don't believe it," George Fallowfield said suddenly, his voice shaking. "Hugo, you—" "Enough," Hugo snapped, his voice rising in frustration. "You don't understand. None of you do. I was doing this for us. I was trying to help us both. Rosamund, I thought we could be together. I thought if I could just get the ring, I'd be able to change everything." "Change everything," Rosamund said, her voice a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "You were using me the whole time?" Hugo lowered his gaze, guilt and regret flooding his features. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could control it, but I didn't realize how much damage I was causing. Miss Marple took a step forward, her tone final. And that's where you went wrong, Hugo. You thought you could control it, but people, emotions, and motives, they aren't so easily controlled. And now you've lost everything. There was a long silence as everyone absorbed Miss Marple's words. The weight of the revelation hung in the air, and for a brief moment the entire village hall seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Hugo's shoulders slumped in defeat. I never meant for it to come to this," he muttered. Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic smile. "No one ever does. But the truth always finds a way to surface, Hugo, and it has now